Hello, I'm Michael Parker, and welcome to God Save the King. I'm here today with biblical researcher and historian Tim Keyes to talk about his research into the Nativity. Welcome, Tim.
Thank you, Michael.
Tim, explain to me what it is that we're going to learn over the next several episodes of God Save the King.
Well, God Save the King, very simply, is telling the Nativity story, the birth of Jesus Christ. But I am telling it with a twist. God Save the King is based on two fundamental premises. Number one, Jesus was not born on December 25th. And then number two, when we tell the traditional version of the Nativity story, we tend to tell it almost as if it's in a historical vacuum. We tend to leave out the historical persons and events that would have surrounded the birth of Jesus Christ. You see, the birth date of Jesus is knowable from the Bible. It's just not knowable in the way most people expect to find it. So we start by correcting the birth date. But when we correct the birth date, we're correcting one of several misconceptions. And when we correct that birth date, it reveals another misconception. So when we correct that one, it reveals another misconception, and you wind up with almost a domino effect. The way I look at it is it's like a jigsaw puzzle. And you dump all the pieces out on the table, and you flip them over, and you got to put them all together to get the correct picture. But once we get that picture, we have a timeless epic that is far more interesting than the traditional version. It's more interesting, it's more rational, it's more reasonable, and in my opinion, it's also more exciting. So even though we're going to focus primarily on the history of the Nativity story and not the theology, it also opens the doors to those kinds of conversations, which in my opinion means we wind up getting a better understanding of who Jesus is and what he's really like.
You mentioned plausibility and reasonable. That's intriguing to me, but why does this matter? Faith does not require that.
Well, the reason I think this is important is because the holiday that we have come to know as Christmas, which we directly associate with the birth of Christ, is actually a modern invention. It's what I like to call an invented tradition. It was deliberately manufactured to appear as if it is a long-standing domestic tradition, when in reality, Christmas is really only about 150 to 200 years old. And if I were to go into the details of the history of Christmas, it's actually quite irreverent and almost vulgar. An unfortunate fact is, when we listen to Christmas carols and we see Christmas pageants and nativity scenes and things like that, it's tragic, but they're riddled with biblical and historical errors. So the result of this is that we carry around incorrect mind pictures in our heads, and we can't help it. We just have to, because we're fed the wrong information. And the Bible says that Jesus himself wasn't all that keen on tradition. He blasted the Pharisees on several occasions for what he called the traditions of men, that they would exalt their traditions so much that they would wind up contradicting the very commandment they thought they were keeping. So for me, it's difficult for me to understand how this is acceptable for devout Christians or frankly anybody who's interested in historical accuracy.
Okay, well let's roll back a little bit. Let's take this to the beginning. How do we know for sure that December 25th is not the birth date of Jesus Christ?
Well, to start with, there's no explicit mention of his birth date in the Bible. His birth is mentioned, the event of his birth is mentioned, but we are not told the date. The Bible simply doesn't say Jesus was born on December 25th.
A lot of people believe that it is implied in the Bible that Jesus was born in winter. That's not true?
Well, yeah, see, now that's not there either. So once again, there's no explicit mention that he was born in the winter, and like you just hinted at a moment ago, it's actually not even implied that he was born in winter. We get that from Christmas carols and Christmas cards, and frankly, the fact that we have been celebrating it in winter for, a couple hundred years.
All right. I'm not trying to badger you, but here again, this is the 21st century, and I put it to you, why is this important? And I ask that because Christians all over the world celebrate his birth on what they believe is his birthday.
Mm-hmm.
Even if it's wrong, is that not more important than knowing the correct date?
Well, that brings up a couple of other interesting points. Number one, the very concept of worshiping on his birthday. Again, this may come as a surprise, but that's not in the Bible either. There's no explicit mention of honoring him or worshiping him on his birthday. And again, it's not even implied that we're supposed to do that. As a matter of fact, several early church historians, they debated that very subject as well, whether that was really an appropriate thing to do, which was to try to honor him on his birthday. There's a very interesting quote made during colonial America by a man named Ezra Stiles. Ezra Stiles was the 7th president of Yale University. He was a congregational minister, and he made a great statement. He said, and I'm paraphrasing, but he said, if we're supposed to honor Jesus on his birthday, it would have been really good if he would have let us know when that was.
That's a solid point.
I agree. So I know for me, now see, the Bible clearly says that God looks upon the heart. So I'm not challenging anybody's heart on the matter. God looks upon the heart. But I know for me, the heart cannot rejoice in what the mind rejects as being untrue. So the goal of God Save the King is to correct these misconceptions and to retell the story in a way that's really exciting and inspiring. And that really is what God Save the King is all about.
Tim, if the Bible does not explicitly say his birth date, isn't it possible that December 25th is his birth date? And beyond that, shouldn't there be some form of historical records that we could use to either confirm or deny that being the right date?
Well, Michael, there are some historical records, but the bottom line is they're pretty weak.
What do you mean by weak? Explain.
Well, I mean, they lack substance. See, when we judge historical documentation, when we look at historical documents, ancient documents, we actually judge them by 3 criteria. So number one, we start with how far removed from the event was the document written? Because that's easy to understand. Mm-hmm. We can see that if the document was 10 years later, 50 years later, or 100 years later, that makes a big difference. So number one, how far removed date-wise is the document from the event?
Mm-hmm.
Number two, how many records are there? Is it 1? Is it 5? Is it 10? Is it 50? Is it 100? So again, that's a big difference, because if there's only 1 record, that's pretty weak. If there's 50 records, that's really saying something. And finally, how do these individual records line up with one another? Are they consistent, or do they contradict one another? Is the information in the document reliable?
That all makes sense. That's all logical. Are there any documents that point to the December 25th date?
So there are a couple of documents that talk about December 25th. The first one is in about 210 AD. So think about that for a second. That's, do the math, 180 years after Jesus walked the earth, let alone after he was actually born. And this record was written by a man named Hippolytus of Rome. And he said, for the first advent of our Lord in the flesh, when he was born in Bethlehem, 8 days before the calends of January, the 4th day of the week, while Augustus was in his 42nd year. Now, at first glance, that sounds a little bit confusing, but basically what it's referring to is a December 25th birthday, 8 days before the 1st of January. The calends of January is December 25th. But to put this in perspective, this is one record. So one record doesn't really carry a lot of weight, so we have to move on to the second record. Now, the second record is what is known as the calendar of Philocalus, and this was recorded about 140 years after this. So the first record we have that we know of that mentions the December 25th birth date is in about 210 AD, and then the second record we have is 140 years later in about 350, 355 AD in this calendar of Philocalus. And in the calendar of Philocalus, it's not really a calendar, it's more like an almanac, okay? And when we find this reference, because that's all it is, it's just a little reference, and it's actually abbreviated, and it's in Latin. So in the abbreviated Latin, it simply says 8 calends, January, nativity, Christ, Bethlehem, Judea. All abbreviated. But really, when you unabbreviate it, okay, and translate it from the Latin, it says the same thing the first one did, which is that Jesus was born 8 days before the calends of January in Bethlehem of Judea. It's actually a possibility that he's quoting the earlier document.
That makes sense to me. What you're describing, frankly, sounds flimsy. So, as to the historical veracity of those two documents. So I'm with you on that. But is there any kind of conclusion that we can draw from all this?
Well, of course, because this is it. This is the early evidence. Once we get past this date, once we start getting into about the 5th century, any document that is mentioning a December 25th birth date is quoting an earlier document. That means it's not an independent source. So when we're looking at independent sources that try to verify a December 25th birth date, we have 2. So if we go back to the criteria that we started with, number 1, how far after the fact are they? One of them is 180 years later, and the next one is 140 years after that. How many do we have? We have 2. We don't have 10, we don't have 20, we don't have 50, we have 2. And then how well do they compare? Well, they actually compare relatively well, but that's because one is probably quoting the other. So the conclusion that we are forced to reach, frankly, is that the historical documentation, the early historical documentation of a December 25th birth date is very weak.
Tim, I agree with you. Only 2 citations. We mentioned before, that is weak. I agree with you. That's not great evidence, but what would strong evidence look like?
Yeah, it's a good idea to have a standard for comparison. So like I said, all historical documents are judged according to those 3 criteria. How far after, how many copies, and then how well do the copies compare to each other. So let's look at some historical examples. Let's talk about Homer's Iliad. That was written in about 800 BC. Now that's quite a bit earlier. But as an example, the earliest records we have of Homer's Iliad are 400 years later, 400 BC. And there's about 600 copies of Homer's Iliad. And then when you contrast and compare them, they're rock solid. That's good historical evidence. So 400 years seems like a long time after, but something we have to remember is that in that day and time, there's no originals anymore. Unless they were etched in stone, if like they were written on papyrus, papyrus decays, it doesn't exist anymore. So that's why these records are from much later, okay? So 400 years, 600 plus copies, pretty good comparison between the 2. So that's pretty extraordinary documentation, but let's look at another example closer to the time frame. Everybody knows who Julius Caesar was. Julius Caesar was very famous for the wars he fought in what we would call France. At the time, they would have called it Gaul. And he wrote a book, The Wars of Gaul, all right? So that was written in about 50 BC, right? The records that we have for that, the earliest ones are from about 900 AD. So that's almost 1,000 years later, and we only have about 10 extant copies. So and yet that is still considered relatively good textual verification. 10 copies, 1,000 years later, not too bad. But let's look at one more example, because this is a famous one. We all have heard who Plato is, right? The famous Greek philosopher. All of his writings, they would have been written about 400 BC. And yet the earliest copies we have there are about 900 AD. And believe it or not, we only have about 7 extant copies. The reason I'm saying all this is because of the Bible. The Bible, okay, the Old and the New Testament, the Old Testament started to be written about 1200 BC. The New Testament was finished by about 100 AD. We have some New Testament documents that are from as close as 50 years after they occurred, and we have thousands and thousands of copies. Not 10, not 50, not 100, thousands. So the Bible is the most historically verifiable book in existence. So when we start talking about these historical records for when was Jesus born, was he born on December 25th? 2 records, one 180 years later, another 140 years after that. Not great textual transmission compared to these other records, even the historical ones, even to Plato, okay, 7 extant copies, or Caesar, 10 extant copies. It's pretty darn weak. But the real point is when we compare it to the Bible, because the Bible is a historical record. That's the simple fact. You can't just put the Bible in a completely different category. It's in the same category. It is an historical record. So when we compare those records with the Bible, it's a blatant contradiction. So we have to come to the conclusion that those documents are the error, that the Bible is not the error, but that those historical documents are.
You make a good argument. It's compelling. I'm still trying to get at this fact, though, that you said the Bible does not give an explicit date of Jesus' birth.
Right, it doesn't. No New Testament writer makes a statement about the date of his birth. None of their successors made an explicit date about his birth. None of their successors made an explicit date about his birth. It's only when you get to the 3rd generation you get one mention. One mention. It takes 180 years for someone to make any mention of it whatsoever, and that is more than enough time, believe me, in the historical context. That is more than enough time for wrong ideas to get in the picture, so to speak.
Tim, when was Jesus Christ born?
Well, I mentioned earlier that there's no explicit date given in the Bible, but the reality of it is there's a very cryptic mention of Jesus' birthday in the Bible. And when you decipher it, when you decode it, it's actually incredibly precise. I think it's going to surprise a lot of people exactly when Jesus was born, because it's actually right there. It's just that it's in code.
Tim, again, when was Jesus Christ born?
Mike, I'm going to tell you, but I think we need to do some deeper investigation first.